Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to this Governors for Schools webinar. The focus of our webinar this morning is safeguarding in 2022. We're delighted to welcome so many of you here. We have got some very large numbers this morning, so please, any questions, put them on the Q&A panel, and we'll do our level best to be able to respond to them. But if we don't manage to respond to every single one, we will get back to you after the event. A warm welcome from Linda and myself this morning. My name is Steve Barker and we're from Better Governor. We're delighted to actually be hosting this webinar this morning on behalf of Governors for Schools. And Better Governor is an online platform that provides services for governors up and down the country. It's free to register for, and we spend a lot of our time actually delivering webinars. So, as I say, we're thrilled to be here this morning. And as you can see, I'm joined by my colleague Linda Waghorn, who's on the other end of the line. Hi there, Linda.
Hi, good morning, everyone.
And between us, we're going to guide you through this session this morning. But as I say, it is your session, so please, any questions or comments, then do put those on the panel, and we'll actually try and respond to those as we go along. But as far as the aims for today's session are concerned, what we want to do first and foremost is actually put safeguarding into some context. So really what we'll think about is what does safeguarding actually mean for us as governors and trustees? What do we need to know about it as we approach the new academic year beginning in the autumn term, and obviously going forward from there? Many of you will undoubtedly be aware that there is a new version of Keeping Children Safe in Education, which is the seminal guidance document from the Department for Education relating to safeguarding, and we'll be exploring the changes in that new version of Keeping Children Safe, with a specific emphasis on the implications for those of us involved in school governance. And as we always try and do with all of the sessions that we run for Governors for Schools, we want to bring a little bit of clarity to this in terms of the specific governance role and how, as governors and trustees, we should be aiming to enhance our strategic overview of safeguarding in our schools. So with no more ado, I'm going to hand over to Linda, who's going to talk to the first few slides with you.
Thank you, Steve. So we're going to start with that first aim and think about safeguarding the overview. And we like to start with thinking about what are the legal documents that shape our practice and help us gain an understanding of the subject as a whole. So on the left-hand side of your screen here, you'll see a document called Working Together to Safeguard Children. We're not expecting any governor to go away and read these documents, although they are available if you so wish. But basically, the Working Together guidance is one which is directed at the agencies that work together. It's a cooperation between local partners, which consist of the police, usually local commissioning, clinical commissioning groups, and the local authorities' social services agencies. And this is the guidance documents that promote cooperation between those organisations, so that there are protocols for sharing information, and the guiding background to here is that it is about promoting and protecting children's safeguarding. There is a role, and it's very clear at the beginning of this guidance that there is a role for everyone who comes into contact with children and families, has a role to play, and therefore there is specific guidance on the right-hand side, keeping children safe in education for all schools. And it doesn't matter what type of school you are, it applies equally to all schools. And you can see that it is labelled as statutory guidance, which means it has a legal force. And this is the document that all schools must have regard to. Both of these documents have both a statutory and an operational element. So you can think from an operational element, your schools and what they do on the ground. The agencies working together on what they do on the ground, there is guidance there. But we're thinking today in terms of our board role, what is our responsibility from an oversight point of view? What is our role here, and how do we do that effectively? So these are the guiding documents. Those are the ones that inform practice. It's statutory, so we must have an understanding of what those documents require us to do, the expectations and the responsibilities. And as Steve mentioned, there is a new Keeping Children Safe in Education version for 2022, and we're going to talk about that a little bit so we can understand what where that guidance has been strengthened, and therefore what our oversight of that as boards need to be. So that is the specific safeguarding documentation. Alongside that, our role as a governing board, our statutory role of governance is defined again for all schools and academy trusts in the governance handbook. And primarily the role of safeguarding is part of our compliance responsibility. And you'll find that therefore in the section in the governance handbook on compliance. It is about our strategic leadership role, but we are not at operational level. We are thinking about what we do to ensure that and hold the school to account for all of the responsibilities that are set out in this key safeguarding and safer recruitment guidance. So we are there to ensure that these duties are undertaken effectively, and the kind of things that we might be thinking about in order to discharge those responsibilities are ensuring that policies and procedures and training are in place, up to date, and are effective. And in order to do that, we may wish to have a deeper knowledge of keeping children safe in education. And there is a suggestion in the guidance that we should read and have regard to that. So again, it's a should. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. There is also an important aspect to this in ensuring that our operational staff in school are effectively trained and aware of their responsibilities in the previous guidance to ensure that they take account of any welfare concerns and understand the signs of what to look for and what to do. And there is a specific role there for a designated safeguarding lead, so an operational role in school, who oversees this responsibility at school level. And if you happen to be the safeguarding governor with those additional responsibilities for a deeper level of knowledge in your board, then the designated safeguarding lead, or DSL, that is likely the person that you will interact with. And because you are possibly that governor, or you will know who that governor is on your board, a deeper knowledge of this subject is required in order to undertake your duties effectively. So let's think about what safeguarding might mean and how this is defined in the guidance that I've mentioned. And we might have an outline understanding of what we think safeguarding means, and it can be helpful to define that under those 4 sections of the guidance in terms of what it actually talks about. So there are 4 main areas which the shapes our understanding. The first one is very much about protecting children from maltreatment. So we'll have processes, policies and practice in place in school that help to identify those children who may be subject to maltreatment of a variety of different kinds. And it is about making sure that the school takes action in order to fully protect these children. There is also a preventing aspect to this, and we're looking here at both children's mental, physical health and their development, so meeting those development markers that children of a similar age would be expected to meet. And here this encompasses all of the curriculum offer, the variety of different aspects of delivery of education across clubs and enrichment activities. And this is about helping children as they grow to understand and manage their own risks. How to keep themselves safe as they develop is very important. but there are also some elements of this work that the school will need to recognise when they need to work with other agencies if they are concerned about a child. And again, we're thinking about ensuring pulling together both those strings, making sure that children are developing well from the offer that we're giving them at school, but also making sure we understand where there are areas where they need to have additional support, and that leads to taking action both within school and with outside agencies when certain markers are reached that indicate that additional support might be required in order to protect and support a child through a difficult situation. So it's a very wide remit. Safeguarding covers a huge range from being online to health and mental well-being and everything in between. So it's a very wide umbrella. And we need to develop an understanding of where that is being talked about and how that fits into every part of school life. So it's really important that we gain that basic understanding. If we're looking at what our staff in school will need to have that deeper level of operational training in order to identify and spot the signs of these main kind of abuse, we are looking at these 4 areas. So we might be thinking of physical abuse, and that might typically be bruises, cuts, burns, those kind of things. Emotional abuse will cover all of these other 3 aspects, because of course emotional abuse can arise from all of these, but can exist through mental health and well-being issues, which are very much an area that we've concentrated on in schools over the last couple of years. But bullying, sexual harassment, which is very much an area which we have covered in terms of acknowledging and reacting to, and Steve will talk a little bit more about that as we go along, but links then down to sexual abuse, which can be by men or women. It can be not necessarily something physical. It can be inappropriate language or being exposed to inappropriate material. And then I think we recognise neglect, which is often a focus of those cases that make the headlines, but staff being aware of those subtle changes in children on a day-to-day basis that may indicate that they're not eating well, or they're not being looked after properly, or their well-being is suffering because they're subject to neglect of emotion as well. So these are key indicators for staff. We need to be aware of those from our overview responsibilities, but these are key areas that staff need to be trained in. And when Steve goes on to talk about the detail bits that have been strengthened in 2022, you will see that there will be an expectation that our staff pick up those changes in terms of their training as we move into September 2022. So let's think a little bit more now about what we might be considering in terms of changes. The document has grown. It grew quite substantially last year, 159 pages. There are 174 pages this year. There is additional information in all of those 5 parts. They're called parts, chapters, sections, but it is broken down into 5 parts. And there's a lot of clarification, raising awareness, and there's a few new provisions which we'll take you through in turn. Annex F is an important additional annex. There are a series of annexes which support understanding of the document as a whole, but Annex F details the substantive changes that have been made between the edition that we're currently using in Schools 2021 and the edition that we are expected to use from the 1st of September. There makes an important distinction in the guidance between the use of the word must and should. Must meaning that there is a legal duty to do so, the guidance must be followed, and should indicating where the guidance should be followed unless there is a reason not to do so. And it really is very difficult to make a case for why we wouldn't follow the guidance where it says should. And I think best practice would indicate that we treat them in a similar way, and we follow the guidance which has been based on all of the previous editions of Keeping Children in Safe in Education, as well as case law when things have gone wrong. So that important distinction is there, but our advice is that treat them in a very similar way in following the guidance. So we're going to look at the key changes, and we're going to start by looking at an area that has been clarified in part 1, and part 1 is the part of the guidance which all staff in school, not just teaching staff, all staff that come into contact with children, and I think this is really important that we understand it's not new, but all staff are expected to read and understand part 1. So this is an area that has been strengthened, and I think this is really important that we understand this as governors, because there are children in difficult circumstances, being abused, exploited or neglected, who either are not ready to recognise and understand how they feel and therefore tell somebody, or they may not recognise that their experiences, the things that they're going to, are harmful, may have an impact on their lives. And it clarifies here that children may feel either embarrassed about what's going on and not feel that they can talk about it. But the important thing here is that staff are trained from having a professional curiosity. And it goes back to what I said about working together, that everybody working with children has a role to play. And this is about staff not necessarily having evidence that something is actually happening, but being curious enough to note that something might not be right, and then speaking here to the designated safeguarding lead if they have that concern about a child. Because with every part of safeguarding going right the way back to the beginning of legislation and regulation in this area, it is about putting together small pieces of information that create a picture that alerts people to the fact that there needs to be some action taken. So it's important here that we owe it to our children in our care that this is done at the highest possible level. It is important that staff understand this professional curiosity and the fact that children might not be ready to give them the information, but there may be little signs, little telltale signs that indicate that then there needs to be opportunities created to maybe talk and explain and be supported in what they are experiencing. So again, part of part 1, and it is a fairly detailed section of the guidance, and it is one which, particularly if you are the safeguarding lead governor in your organisation, I would recommend that you read it, and often boards are encouraged as a whole to read part 1, but domestic abuse has been on the increase throughout the pandemic, and also at the moment where economic circumstances are quite difficult for some families, but it can encompass a whole range of behaviours. So it could be a single incident to which maybe the police are called, or it may be a pattern of smaller incidents. And again, the previous slide comes into play here. It may be that it isn't immediately something a child would share, but it could be a pattern of incidents, and it could take a variety of forms. It could be psychological, physical, sexual, and with the financial difficulties, you can see that these situations are likely to be on the increase, certainly in the schools that Steve and I both govern in. The numbers that are reported to us as a board have increased. And children can be victims themselves, or they may witness an incident. And if we're looking at children in the teenage years, they can in fact experience this type of abuse in their own relationships. All of this can have a detrimental effect and a longer term impact on their health and well-being and their ability to engage with their learning. A child who is not happy and comfortable in their own selves will not be in a position to access their learning. So safeguarding is a really important factor to get right at the beginning if we're going to help children be supported in their learning.
Linda, we've got a question on the panel that I think is probably important to actually put in at this place. Tara's asking, she's aware that social services are pushing responsibilities onto schools, which schools very often don't have the capacity, training or legal duty to respond to. And Tara's asking for suggestions. I think the general point I would make there, Tara, is that it does sometimes appear that so children's social care particularly have their own very real statutory responsibilities, but of course keeping children safe and working together, the two key guidance documents, are both statutory, and they do put very specific responsibilities onto schools. Schools are not there to diagnose specifically mental health issues, but they are expected now to be able to recognize, in the same way that we recognize all potential and real vulnerabilities that children have with regard to safeguarding, they're expected to recognise those and then signpost to appropriate agencies. That might be children's social care, it might be child and adolescent mental health, etc. But there is a responsibility on schools to actually be vigilant, and we always talk about that culture of vigilance in safeguarding terms. So I hope that answers your question, Tara.
The other thing that came up in a meeting that board meeting that I was in recently, when we were talking about numbers in domestic abuse, one of the pieces of information that was shared was the number of Encompass reports, and I hadn't heard that term before, and I think it's worth saying to anybody on this call today, when you're talking about safeguarding, the use of language and the way different local authorities work, if you're not sure about what a piece of terminology means, please ask that question, because Encompass, and I believe it is a national programme, is where police who are called to an incident will share the fact that they've been called to an incident with the school under their working together protocols. And whilst the school might not take any immediate action, it does alert the school and those that work with that particular child to be additionally vigilant for any signs of opportunities to express that professional curiosity and engage with the child and offer support if it's required. So I think there's some real evidence of the way in which these agencies work together. Whilst we absolutely do not work at operational level and we do not want details of individual children and families, what we do need to know is, are we seeing some evidence of the way in which our school is working with these other agencies, and are those therefore part of our remit in holding the school to account in their effectiveness? I do absolutely understand that there are big challenges at the moment in a lot of this work, and it's about our best endeavours. That's another piece of language that you'll find, about working with our best endeavours to support these children and signpost them on to the additional help and support to which they are entitled. And at this point, I'm going to hand back to Steve, and he will then pick up from part 2.
Lovely, thanks, Linda. Okay, so as Linda said, part one is the aspect of keeping children safe, that there is a statutory responsibility on the governing board to ensure that all staff receive, read and understand. Part two is actually the section that talks about the leadership and management of safeguarding. So this is the section that encompasses our responsibilities as governors and also goes into a lot of detail as regards to the role of the designated safeguarding lead, or DSL as it's very often abbreviated to. And the first one, and probably the most significant aspect for governance, I think, in terms of the changes for 2022 in keeping children safe, is this particular aspect on governor training, which we've actually got on this slide. Again, bearing in mind what Linda said about the distinction between should and must, this isn't a must, but DFE through this document are saying that governing boards should engage in training on safeguarding specifically as part of induction. This has never been a requirement before, and again, I think it would be very difficult to justify, in terms of that distinction between should and must, any good reason not to do this. Safeguarding, clearly by the very large numbers that we have attending this webinar this morning, is an important aspect of governance, and it's one that clearly you've all recognised by showing up this morning, which is great, and we thank you for that. But we do need to ensure that all members of our governing boards, and it says proprietors here, as you can see, proprietors is the term that the DFE used to refer to the independent sector, and of course academies are referred to as independent schools here. So this means that governing bodies in maintained schools and trust boards and any local governance arrangements in academies, now the expectation is that from September, as part of the induction that hopefully we're all putting in place, or enabling new governors to access, we should have safeguarding as part of that. And then the important additional comment at the bottom here is their training should be regularly updated. That doesn't just mean new governors, that means all of us, of course. Now, you're updating your training and your awareness of safeguarding this morning, and that's fantastic, but I think I would encourage, and I'm sure Linda would join me on this, all governors to go back and start evangelising on this with their schools. We should all make sure our knowledge of safeguarding is up to date. So an important development in that particular aspect. There are some other aspects of part two which are also important for us as governors to be aware of, and one of the most significant ones, and again I think we have to recognise, as Linda said right at the beginning, the document Keeping Children Safe in Education is updated on an annual basis now, and it's updated not just to reflect changes in legislation and guidance, but also to reflect the government's views on how in schools and in education generally we should be responding to certain issues that have arisen. And although it's not explicitly stated here, this new section, which actually outlines in relatively brief terms, but the legislative background in terms of the Human Rights Act and also the European Convention on Human Rights, which is the one in the pink box on the left-hand side of the screen, Equalities Act legislation from 2010, and then the Public Sector Equality Duty. This is all aimed at making sure that staff in schools, and most importantly, as governors, as those responsible here, we are aware of our statutory duties. And of course, all three pieces of legislation and regulation here relate to a statutory position that actually gives rights to children. And I think and it's not mentioned, but as I say, I think probably one of the key drivers for this is you'll all be aware of the incident that happened in a London school last year, where an adolescent girl was actually searched by police, and there's been a big outcry. There's an inquiry still going on into that. That inquiry, without doubt, is actually going to level some criticism at the police, of course, but it will level some criticism potentially, or by implication, at the school for failing to intervene here. And I think the key piece here, and again, it doesn't just relate to, I think, pupil Q, as the young lady was actually referred to, but if you look at the human rights one there, section 84, article 3 is about the right to freedom from inhuman and degrading treatment, and that's an absolute right, and that transcends virtually every other thing that may happen. So the idea is, of course, that when children, and don't forget that everybody is regarded as a child until they reach their 18th birthday from the perspective of child protection legislation, everybody entering a school as a pupil transfer, or the parents transfer their parental responsibility to the school. In law, it's referred to as in loco parentis, and that means the school has an absolute right to protect those, sorry, an absolute duty rather, to protect the rights of that child. And clearly there are some implications, without getting involved in the specifics, that perhaps wasn't done. I think the other element of this here is, of course, we very often experience in schools now people saying, it's none of your business, I have the right to privacy under human rights legislation. And again, I think key pointer here is that that does not trump the right of children to be safe. So safeguarding legislation, child protection legislation, always takes priority over any other rights implied or explicitly stated that people may have. And as I say, from a strategic governance perspective, we firmly believe that's something governments need to be aware of, and perhaps should be testing with our schools, well, what would we do if we were in that situation? And you can see the various paragraphs there. So if you want to look that up, obviously we've given you the URL on the penultimate slide in this presentation. Feel free to look at those. They're relatively brief, and you can see 2 of them have actually got links to the specific legislation. Another aspect of part 2, which has been updated again because of experiences, context, etc. Clearly, in the last 2.5 years or so, with the emergence of COVID-19 and the implications that's had for schools, one of them being the introduction of remote education, of course, that has brought on a whole host of concerns, and actually accentuated concerns that previously existed with regard to the safety of children engaging in online remote education. And this particular paragraph, new for this year, but this is about the way in which schools engage with and communicate to those with parental responsibility. And the key here is, of course, that for all children, but particularly younger ones, there is an expectation that schools are engaging with parents, telling them how this remote education is actually working. And I think many people will be aware that there's some spikes nationally at the moment in terms of the incidence of infection rates, and remote education is a permanent feature of our system at the moment. There will be youngsters actually accessing remote education this week and going into the last week of term as well. And of course, we want them to be safe in doing that. So schools are expected, and I'm not going to read the whole paragraph to you, but you can see here there's an expectation that parents should be told what to expect in how that remote education works, the sort of websites and perhaps the specifics in terms of the websites that children and young people are expected to access as part of their learning. And also, if there is any direct teaching, who will be doing it and who to expect in terms of faces on their screens, etc. So this is communication, hopefully to broaden awareness of parents and carers, with the intention ultimately, of course, of ensuring that children are safe when they are engaged in online activity, whether that's with regard to remote learning or anything else. We've got a second aspect of online safety here, and that's with regards to filtering. And when we say filtering, what we mean, of course, is those systems. Some people call them Chinese walls, some people call them security provisions, etc. But it's the processes that schools have in place to filter out undesirable, inappropriate content from the school's internet system, and intranets for that matter, to prevent access to children and young people, and sometimes to staff as well. This was an issue probably about 4 or 5 years ago, but I think for me, what this says to us as governors is, when was the last time that we revisited this? It was brought to the forefront 4 or 5 years ago because under the previous inspection framework, a lot of the Ofsted inspectors were going into schools and typing key phrases or key words that they knew and showing them to schools and saying, how come children in your school are allowed to actually access this? Now, it's difficult. We all know that. The people change these things every day of the week. The moment somebody's blocked, they'll find another way of actually trying to get through. But again, this is part of that vigilant culture in schools, and you'll see that bottom sentence there on the screen at the moment. Governing bodies and proprietors should consider the age range of their children, number of children, how often they access IT, and proportionality of cost versus safeguarding risk. So it's acknowledging that, yes, as governors, we are expected to seek assurance that this is being monitored in schools, but our response can be proportionate to the cost. So we're not expected to spend thousands of pounds continually updating this, but we are expected to be vigilant and have appropriate safeguards in place. Okay, again, another section in part 2. So this is the general guidance, just a reminder here of what the responsibilities of all those people involved in the leadership and the management of safeguarding in our schools should actually be doing. This is the last section that we're actually going to draw your attention to in part 2. But nonetheless, it's a really important one. And this is actually brand new, not been mentioned explicitly before. It's been there by implication. But this is about children and young people in our schools who identify as being lesbian, gay, bi, or trans. So in other words, the LGBT communities within our schools. And of course, the reality is here, and all I've done is actually just done a screen print here, so you can see the specific paragraph numbers 202, 3, and 4 here. This is just raising awareness, but also making schools, including us as governors, of course, aware that we have responsibilities. And this comes back to the last but one slide, where we're talking about equalities legislation. Of course, these are protected characteristics. So not only is there a statutory duty here, but of course there is also a responsibility, a moral one, as well as now this guidance, which is statutory guidance in keeping children safe, for us as governors to ensure that the needs of any young people who fall into this category to be protected. Now, we know that bullying and intimidation is an element that sometimes unfortunately can rear its head in schools. This is just about making sure that not only are we protecting those children and young people, but as you can see in that the last of the 3 sections there, 204, with the advent of the new statutory relationship, sex and health education, which came into effect in September 2020, this is part of the statutory curriculum now. So as governors, we should be ensuring that our schools are teaching this. They're teaching children, hopefully, understanding and tolerance is a word that I'm not particularly keen on, but but basically what we should be ensuring is that children and young people in our schools learn that personal choice is exactly that, and we should be accepting and embracing what lifestyle choices anybody makes, whether we agree with them or not is irrespective. We should be respecting those decisions, and hopefully broadening the minds of children and young people, which actually then goes on to ensure that our schools can be free from those homophobic, biphobic, and other forms of bullying that relate to this particular category of pupils. So again, there's some potential questions we might want to ask in governing board meetings there. So I'd say that's the last of the sections on part 2. Part 3 is the safer recruitment section, and this was rewritten significantly and also put on a lot of weight in the 2021 version. And unsurprisingly, there aren't that many significant, there aren't any changes at all, sorry, is what I should say, from the 2021 version here. However, I think what we need to be aware of is certainly the experience of Ofsted this year, and part of our role, we monitor a vast number of Ofsted inspection reports, and increasingly what we're seeing this last 12 months or so is where Ofsted have criticised governing boards in terms of safeguarding, very often lack of attention to detail on safer recruitment, overlooking key aspects of safer recruitment has been something that has commonly been criticised. So as governors, I think it's important that we should not forget that safer recruitment is absolutely a fundamental part of safeguarding, and it's also about compliance. The safer recruitment section of keeping children safe lists every single requirement that should be part of, in every single school, in every single academy up and down the country, those statutory checks that we should ensure are being done, because ultimately what this is saying, of course, is recruitment safe? Because if it's not, we are potentially giving access to children and young people in our schools who may be setting out to harm them, and obviously that's not what we want. So compliance is crucial here, and as governors we should be seeking assurance from our school leaders that recruitment procedures in our schools do comply with legislation. Now, there's a whole variety of different ways we can do that. One, of course, is by asking questions in meetings, but very often governors are invited to sit in on or take part in interview panels for staff, particularly in this time of year, of course. When we're talking about head teacher and deputy head appointments, that's a statutory requirement. They are appointments made by the governing board, not delegated to anybody else. But this is a really important aspect of what we do. And I think part of the monitoring, part of the ensuring compliance here is of course relating to the school's single central record, because that is the document that actually summarizes every single one of those checks that is part of that statutory framework. And it's our responsibility, because again it's compliance, but it's our responsibility as governing boards to ensure that that is complete and that it is, as a single central record, up to date. There is some controversy. There are certain people and certain organisations who are saying it's not a government responsibility to actually physically check the single central record itself. We are not of that mind. We don't share that view. There is an Ofsted video out there that Ofsted is saying they don't expect governors to do that. That's about semantics. I'm afraid Ofsted don't make the rules. Ofsted simply inspect against the rules and the laws of the land. But keeping children safe, the document we're talking about this morning, makes it absolutely clear that this is a compliance aspect, therefore responsibility is at the feet of governors. Now, not saying that you must do it, but if you delegate the responsibility for monitoring the single central record in your governing board to somebody else, be it the head teacher or the school business manager, I think there's a risk there, with the greatest of respect to people holding those roles, that we're asking people to mark their own homework in many ways. As governors, we should be seeking assurance, and there is nothing wrong with a governor once a year, twice a year, depending on the turnover of staff in your school, going in and actually being shown the single central record so that we can check for ourselves that it's compliant. What we should be doing, of course, all of us, is actually ensuring that safer recruitment is on the agenda on a regular basis. Now, regular will change, will vary according to the requirements of your individual schools. So in a small school, probably levels of recruitment and staff turnover aren't as high as they might be in larger schools. But again, if you've got a number of new staff, this is something we should be focusing on. So if you know there's a lot of staff joining your school for September, for the start of a new academic year, you should expect, and if it's not there, we should be asking to see safer recruitment so that governors can seek that assurance on the agenda in the one of the autumn term meetings. And Linda mentioned CPD, or continuous professional development training for staff, but also for governors, of course. When was that training last updated? Have governors actually updated their own training? There's the statutory training you have to do to enable you to sit on the selection panels for head teachers and deputy heads, but that's actually really about safeguarding awareness in a general way, in the way that we're talking about it this morning. There are some very real, some very explicit safer recruitment responsibilities, and governors should make sure that their training and therefore their awareness is up to date on those as well. Okay, we've also got some changes in part 5. Again, this is a section that was updated significantly last year, so there's not there aren't the same number of significant changes here as there might be elsewhere, but there are a couple that we just felt it was important to share with you. And the most significant of those, of course, is the change in the title. And this, my view is that this was done just to make it very clear to everybody looking at this chapter what this related to. I think most people will be aware of what an allegation is. An allegation, for the most part, is when an adult in a school environment is accused of doing something which is considered inappropriate from a safeguarding perspective to a child. That could be verbal, it could be physical, it could cross a number of those different barriers that we've already talked about. The title now has been changed to Safeguarding Concerns and Allegations Made About Staff, including supply teachers, volunteers and contractors. And the reason for that change is because now it is absolutely explicit. It applies to all of those people in the title. And I think the most significant change there is that you don't have to just be a teacher or somebody who works in the school itself. You can be visiting, it might be a regular visitor, it might be a one-off, but allegations can be made against anybody and should be taken seriously. And of course, part of taking seriously is making sure that they are reported, and if they meet the threshold, then forwarded on to the local authority. And all local authorities must have a post there called the LADO, or referred to as the LADO. It actually stands for Local Authority Designated Officer. But even if it's a contractor and they're just coming as a one-off, if they say or do something in your school which you think is incompatible with the principles of safeguarding, it must be reported in the appropriate way. And that, again, is a compliance aspect and something as governors we need to be aware of. There's also some clarification on something that changed last year. Last year, there was the introduction of this concept of low-level concerns, and that low level means that they don't meet the threshold for raising with that local authority designated officer, the LADO that I've just mentioned. And what we have this year, which I think is actually personally very helpful, is clarification that even if it is a low-level concern, it still needs to be reported, it still needs to be shared, and that means shared with the school's designated safeguarding lead. And an example that you might find helpful there, most schools will have a policy that says staff should not use their mobile phones during school hours, or certainly not in front of pupils. A low-level concern would be that perhaps somebody has been seen talking on their phone when they're on duty on the school field at lunchtime this week in the nice weather. That's a low-level concern. Of course, it should be reported, because that's inappropriate behaviour and hopefully would be against the school's code of conduct or staff behaviour policy. What might make it meet threshold is if that member of staff was using their phone to take photographs of children, because that clearly is a major safeguarding risk. So that's the distinction. That would actually meet threshold for referring on, and there could be disciplinary measures taken as a consequence of that. Part 5, and Linda alluded to this a little bit earlier in some of the comments that she made, talking about those 4 domains of safeguarding concerns. Child-on-child sexual abuse and sexual harassment has been a significant concern now, probably emanating out of the Everyone's Invited, what started off as an Instagram page and then went to a website, and it went viral about 18 months or so ago now, led to Ofsted being asked to undertake some research, which was commissioned by the Department for Education. And the response to that was that, yes, this is a problem that we've known about for quite some time, but nobody really understood the scale of that problem. And Ofsted absolutely believe that this is tip of the iceberg. So it has become a major focus in Ofsted inspections. That's not why we should be concerned with it as governors, of course. If it's a concern within safeguarding, there's a motivation of its own for governors to actually take interest there. the first bullet point there is purely out of interest, but I think just to demonstrate the significance that the department is actually putting behind this now, Department for Education, that is. Last year was a new section put in, and that was 18 pages. It's now gone up to 30 pages. So there is a lot of information here, a lot of information for staff, really about raising awareness, information that can be used in training for them and also for us as governors. But also giving guidance on, very explicit guidance on how to respond to children and young people, also how to ensure that they are aware of their rights, their responsibilities, what's appropriate, what's not, etc. And that next bullet point about paragraph 468, and that's what those numbers relate to here, is the specific paragraph if you wanted to reference it afterwards. There's a new paragraph all about ensuring that children and young people actually understand that the law is there, first and foremost, to give protection to them. It's not about criminalising young people. This is saying, first and foremost, this is a safeguarding aspect very firmly, and we should be seeking to protect children, not to vilify them. There's another paragraph about interfamilial harms, and that's where you've got a child in a family who perhaps is a victim of child-on-child sexual abuse and sexual harassment. And this is making the point to school staff that where that happens, clearly in a family situation, there can be obvious anxiety, upset caused, etc., and that can overspill to other siblings. And this is just making schools aware that where they have been made aware of a youngster, and may not even be a pupil of that school, just to make sure that there are appropriate support mechanisms put in place for any siblings following instance that may be needed. And that links into that last bullet point here, which is, although this is in keeping children safe and therefore it's aimed at schools, this bullet point is aimed at other agencies as well. Notably the police. I'm not criticising the police here, but I possibly am, but with greatest respect to the police, they are not always the best at sharing information. And what this is saying is that from the statutory safeguarding partners, and that will be children's social care rather, and the police, of course, they have to recognise that schools are what are legally known as a relevant agency, and very much in cases of child-on-child sexual abuse and sexual harassment, schools have got to be involved in those discussions about what's happened, but also how this is actually going to be responded to. And I forgot to make the point earlier, so apologies for that, but child-on-child sexual abuse and sexual harassment, this is what was formerly called peer-on-peer. I think the evolution to calling it now child-on-child is really part of the government's determination to say this is a real issue. It's about children, it's about safeguarding. Let's not dress it up in saying peer-on-peer. Let's make it absolutely explicit what we're referring to here. And that brings us on to probably our penultimate slide in terms of maybe some questions to think about ourselves. Do we know what the answers to these questions are? If we don't, then maybe questions that you might want to take back to either a committee meeting or to the full board meeting in your own schools and trusts. First and foremost, we spent a lot of time this morning thinking about the changes in this year's Keeping Children Safe in Education. When are staff in your school going to be made aware of those changes? Lots of schools will have inset days planned for early September. Part of my day job is that I am a safeguarding trainer, and I know that I've already got 3 sessions on safeguarding, focusing on this that I'm delivering on. I think it's the 5th of September, which I think is the first day of term. But we need to know as governors in our own boards, when are our staff going to be made aware of these changes? And then, of course, going back to what Linda said about part 1 at the beginning of the session, as governors, it's our responsibility to ensure that staff receive, read and understand part 1 of Keeping Children Safe. But how do we actually know that they understand? How do we know that they've got that clarity about what the expectations are on them and their specific role in school? And again, sorry, Linda.
Just to interrupt you there, Steve, there is a question that Ian has asked about a safeguarding questionnaire that could be used to test staff and new recruits and act as a prompt. And I think it was worth raising it here because I know you and I are not great fans of checklists. This is about understanding the context in your own school, and then your oversight of this is about testing the evidence that is shared with you by the head teacher, thinking about what the safeguarding risks are in your school. And if you are a governor that is doing a monitoring visit, either a safeguarding visit, or it may be that there is always a safeguarding part of any monitoring visit to school, it's about thinking about those questions that would be appropriate to ask given what you already know. And this is more, I think, Steve, you'd agree here, about effectiveness rather than an exercise where you check a box and therefore believing that that box has been checked, believe that practice is effective. And that's really not what we're looking at as governors. What evidence have we got? What does the data tell us? What are our risk factors? How well are we doing against that by what we're asking and how we're holding the school to account on a kind of live meeting by meeting or visit by visit basis?
No, I would absolutely agree, Linda, and I think part of my day job again is I do from time to time undertake safeguarding audits for schools, and I was in a school last week conducting a safeguarding audit, and I asked the head teacher, who happened to be the designated safeguarding, how do they know that staff understand? And I got a fascinating response in that the SLT, the senior leadership team in that school, they actually look at that. They use an online reporting system called CPOMS, which is Child Protection Online System, I think. And they look at that, and they look across the school at where concerns have been raised, as a way of saying, well, there's been no concerns at all raised in this class. Is that because everyone's perfectly safe, or is that because safeguarding isn't being taken quite as seriously? So I would absolutely agree. And I think the checklist, it's easy to tick a box, but what's the evidence that backs that up? So no, I think you're absolutely right, Linda. Okay, again, coming back to a comment that Linda made earlier, that very first slide about children and young people who may not be ready to talk about their experiences in terms of child abuse, etc. That concept of professional curiosity. Personally, I think those are actually very effective words. And I think that idea that as governors, we should be asking, well, do staff have that professional curiosity? Because it's a lot easier to, say, okay, they don't want to talk about it, that's fine. But actually, that's not effective discharging of your duty as a member of staff. If we note that, a child, and again, we say child is anybody under the age of 18 in our schools, if a child is displaying potential characteristics, and these are, we're not making accusations, we're not saying something's definitely happened here, but if we are concerned that there are some changes in behavior, demeanor, all of those things that may potentially be an indicator, we have a statutory duty to report it. And hopefully there's a moral imperative for us as well, because we want children and young people to be safe. So that's what this is really all about. Again, just a reminder, as far as those online filtering systems are concerned that we talked about, when was the last time that we actually sought assurance from school leaders that our system is up to date? How often is it checked, and how comprehensive are those checks? And of course, just a final reminder, as governors, we've got that new requirement about training. We should be doing it. What's happening in your board? What's happening in your school in terms of ensuring that governors do have that ability to access training on induction, and all of the rest of us do ensure that we update our training as we're moving forward. That is the end of what Linda and I wanted to say this morning, folks. If there are any more questions, now is the time. We've got quite a few on the panel at the moment. I don't know, Linda, whether there's any specific ones that you think we should address at this point.
I have replied to people individually. I think a little bit of flavour here is about, there were a few questions around the safer recruitment training, about whether it expires once you've undertaken that piece of official training. It doesn't have an expiry date, but best practice would suggest, as keeping children safe changes and get strengthened each year, that as a minimum every 3 years having a look at doing a refresher, at least understanding what it is that has changed, and therefore what you're responsible for ensuring that is a good idea. Apart from that, there were a few questions around very specific incidents, which are probably more operational than strategic, and therefore I don't think there's a theme that comes through strongly that we need to pick up.
Okay, fine. I can see there's one on the which we will just reply. I'm just aware we're running out of time. So if there are any questions on the panel, folks, that we haven't explicitly responded to, we will go through all of those and we'll get back to you electronically. But just a general comment, which I think is worth picking up on. James has actually asked regarding the single central record, what if you come up against arguments from the school about data protection? Very clear response from me on that one, James, and everybody else for that matter, is data protection is relevant, of course it is, but actually if the single central record is actually created using the information that is required on it from keeping children safe in terms of those headings, the only personal data on it should be somebody's name, and that's in the public domain as far as the school's concerned anyway. So if your school's single central record contains dates of birth, address, telephone number, and other personal data, it doesn't need to. All of that is somewhere else. That information does not need to be there. And I think from a perspective of governors checking it, it's not sensible for it to be there anyway, I would say. So thank you very much, folks. As I say, we've got lots and lots of people on the session this morning, which is a joy to see. And thank you for taking the time for joining us. Thank you for the all of the questions that have come in. As I say, we will respond to them and get back to you if we haven't actually covered that in this morning's session. Enjoy the rest of your day. Sun is shining where I am. I hope it is where you are too. Have a good summer, and we look forward to welcoming you to more webinars in the autumn term. Thank you very much indeed. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.